Okay, we're recording. Hi, it's Thomas Cox. I'm on the road, so you'll forgive me if I keep my video off, but I really want to focus on our guest at this ISSDG session, the International Society for the Study of Decentralized Governance. And our guest this month is Angela Walch. Angela has written in particular about the phenomenon of decentralization, and her paper Deconstructing Decentralization, Exploring the Core Claim of Crypto Systems, was forwarded to me by Chris Pollard, who's an ISSDG member. And I thought it was very compelling and interesting. And rather than try to summarize it, I figured we'd listen to the author herself explain that paper, her latest thinking about it, and so forth. And we'll just go straight into it. If you got slides, you can present them now.
I do, yes. Let me see if I can figure out how to get them up. So
Super.
Share screen or something, I think.
Share screen. And let's see, as I recall, you are a professor at St. Mary's University School of Law in San Antonio.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Yes, I am. Can you guys see the screen, my slides at this point? Okay, great. All right, so I will go ahead and run them then. Okay, great. So hi, everybody. I'm Angela Walch, as Thomas said, and I'm a professor of law here in San Antonio, Texas, and I'm also affiliated with the Center for Blockchain Technologies at University College London. And I have been following the work of many of the people in the group, and I'm hoping to meet some of you at various conferences as we go along. So I am grateful for the invitation to talk with you today. I think we're all thinking about similar issues. So this paper is called Deconstructing Decentralization, Exploring the Core Claim of Crypto Systems. And it's kind of one in a series. As I've been thinking about blockchain technologies and crypto systems for a while, I've been going through various words that are used to describe these systems and their features and thinking about them, trying to really press on them and see if we can figure out what they mean, because I think their meanings have very strong implications for our beliefs about the systems. And if our beliefs about the systems don't match their true capabilities, I think we risk creating potentially systemic problems down the road because we've misunderstood things. So here I am talking about the buzzword decentralization or decentralized, because that seems to me to be pretty much the most ubiquitous of the terms. I've looked at words like immutable before and trustless. I'm gradually, making my way through. Okay, so this is this is how we will proceed today. I'm going to talk a little bit about why this.
Oh, real quick.
Sure.
You're rather than sharing your slideshow, you're sharing your PowerPoint program, which it shows like it's what you would see if you were editing.
Are you kidding? Oh, okay. I see the slideshow running. So let me see.
Yeah.
Huh.
I'll stop you from sharing, and then you can hit share again, but just share your whole screen.
Okay. Great.
A particular program. We've had that before. We went through an entire presentation by one of our
where you just got
folks. We all just watched the title screen.
So so you can't see my slides at the moment.
Yeah, right? I just stopped the sharing. So
okay. Gosh. Okay, I'm trying to figure out how it will let me do that, but I will just click in that window then. Because never mind, I don't need to explain that to you. I will just work in that window. Okay, that's fine. I'll just work within here.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, you can see that, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So how we will proceed today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why decentralization is so relevant at the moment, particularly. And then we'll talk about how would we figure out what this term means? What do we know about decentralization? I think it has a lot to do with our beliefs about where power and agency sit in the system or do not sit. And I think this whole discussion has lots of implications for both our legal and risk analyses, and then I will offer some closing reflections. Okay, so let's just talk at a very high level about decentralization first. It's stated very often as a fundamental characteristic of crypto systems. People talk about it as just their basic reason for being, right? It's we've seen talk about decentralized finance, DeFi, DApps. Everything is decentralized, and that is part of what I think people use to capture the magic about these systems. That it's something different than what we have previously been dealing with, and that term is, picked up in various places. It is in academic papers that you read about crypto systems and blockchain systems. It's stated, blockchain is a decentralized system. It is actually showing up in law now. There are a number of pieces of legislation that have been passed in various jurisdictions, particularly in the US, that use the term decentralized in their definition of blockchain systems or crypto systems. And they do that generally without providing a definition of decentralized. So this word is starting to have some legal meaning. And it shows up, as we know, there's so many conferences in the crypto space, and you see the decentralized world, the decentralized systems. It's everywhere, and it's super important because in the past year or so, it's become relevant to potentially even the securities law analysis of these crypto systems and the tokens that come from them. The Securities and Exchange Commission in the U.S. has used this term, decentralized, apparently to help it evaluate whether a token on a given system is going to be treated as a security. So the SEC has talked about Ethereum and Bitcoin as being systems that are, quote, sufficiently decentralized such that the tokens on them should not be treated as security. So the term is extremely important in all discussions, really, about blockchain systems, so we need to know what it means. Okay, so what might it mean? What are people trying to convey when they talk about a decentralized system? It could have a number of meanings. One of them is just a very kind of practical description of the network that these systems run on. So they run on lots of computers, right, instead of just one computer. So there is not a central computer that operates everything. It's more than one, so it's decentralized. And this aspect of the system, this practical characteristic of it, is said to make the system resilient. So if there are more than one computer that the system operates on, then it's really hard to knock the whole thing out. It's going to keep enduring. So as long as you have one node left in the network, arguably the record is going to survive. It also, decentralized can also be seen as a description of the power dynamics within these systems. And we saw that, right away with the creation of Bitcoin and how the discussion of Bitcoin really has continued since the beginning, that these systems seek to get away from central trusted third parties, such as financial institutions or governments, and basically distribute power away from that central party to the group. Okay, so power is intended to be diffuse among many people, and so there's not one central party. And that also can mean that there's no central site of accountability. We have managed to distribute power, and because of that distribution of power, maybe it doesn't make sense to pin accountability to really anyone within that system. So these are some possible ways we can think about a decentralized system. There are a whole bunch of different writings on this. I looked at many different theories and papers as I was putting together my own paper, and some people want to quantify decentralization, right? Let's see, can we count the nodes and figure out how decentralized this is? Or is there a way to capture in some sort of a more formal way how decentralized a given system is? So since I'm a law professor, I want to think a little bit about what we're seeing with decentralized as a legal term. So this first came up in a speech from Bill Hinman, who is the Director of Corporation Finance, I believe is his title, at the SEC. He gave a speech that was widely watched in the crypto space in June of 2018. And this is where he talked about whether Bitcoin and Ethereum should be considered, the tokens on those systems should be considered to be securities. This has been in the context of the whole initial coin offering boom and token offerings, and people, really regulators around the world, trying to figure out how to characterize these tokens within their existing legal frameworks. So the important parts of this speech for purposes of our discussion today, I've highlighted a few quotes that get at this decentralized topic. Okay, so the first bullet point here: if the network on which the token or coin is to function is sufficiently decentralized, where purchasers would no longer reasonably expect a person or group to carry out essential managerial or entrepreneurial efforts, the assets may not represent an investment contract. Second one here: where the efforts of the third party are no longer a key factor for determining the enterprise's success, material information asymmetries recede. As a network becomes truly decentralized, the ability to identify an issuer or promoter to make the requisite disclosures becomes difficult and less meaningful. Okay, I'm going to take these apart in a second, but let's just see what else the SEC had to say about this. Okay. Hinman tells us, when he looks at Bitcoin today, I do not see a central third party whose efforts are a key determining factor in the enterprise. The network on which Bitcoin functions is operational and appears to have been decentralized for some time, perhaps from inception. Okay. Second bullet point there: based on my understanding of the present state of Ether, the Ethereum network and its decentralized structure, current offers and sales of Ether are not securities transactions. And then finally, we get some thoughts about other systems. Over time, there may be other sufficiently decentralized networks and systems where regulating the tokens and coin that function on them as securities may not be required. Okay, so decentralization has something really important to do with whether a token is going to be considered a security. So if we look at the language closely from this speech, we see some repeating themes here. Okay, so first of all, it seems to have something to do with the network. The SEC seems to be focusing on the network. Remember, we talked earlier about, ways, what are people using decentralized to mean? One of those was the physical characteristics of the network, right? Mm-hmm. How many computers there are. So as a network becomes truly decentralized, we see in my first bullet point here, the network on which Bitcoin functions is operational and appears to have been decentralized for some time. That's the second bullet point. Number 3, we're talking about the Ethereum network. And then finally, in the final one, there may be other sufficiently decentralized networks and systems. Okay, so that seems to be a component of this for the SEC. Also, there's something very interesting going on, I think. We're looking for the people doing things in the system, the people who are doing important things that might justify the securities regulation, right? And the SEC is having a hard time finding them in these systems, right? The ability to identify an issuer or promoter becomes difficult. Second one, I do not see a central third party whose efforts are a key determining factor. And again, right here at the end, we see the mention and focus on the central actors whose efforts are a key to the success of the enterprise. Of course, and that last one referring to the lack of them. So we're talking about counting computers and we're looking for power. The SEC can't see the power. Okay, I thought this was pretty entertaining. The response from the crypto space, researchers and some thought leaders in the space after this came out was this quote from Neha Narula, who's at MIT DCI. "I'm a little worried people from government agencies are throwing around the word decentralization like we know what it means and how to evaluate it." This was in response to Hinman's speech. Meltem Demirors later on that summer talked about decentralization being a myth. Okay, so within the crypto space, we're seeing a lot of critique of the term decentralized. And I think my paper, which I started writing back in the summer of 2018, was kind of in that vein as well. The website Are We Decentralized Yet? Was started, I believe, by the founder of Dogecoin, and was basically looking at how expensive it was to perform a 51% attack on any given currency. So kind of mocking the idea of decentralization actually being real. All right, so let's take this apart a little bit. Let's deconstruct what we mean by decentralization. Okay, first of all, no one knows what it means. We use the term as if we know what it means, but we're not necessarily being clear about that. Neha's comment on the slide before, if she doesn't know what it means, and if other people in the, people thinking deeply about these systems don't know what it means, I'm not sure who does, or at least that we agree. I don't think that people agree on what it means. So some things to keep in mind, right? These are, as we're thinking about using the term decentralized or decentralization. Okay, first, these are extremely complex systems, and they are multi-layered. So we have different parties who are participating in them, such as software developers, such as the validators within the systems, and we have the nodes within the systems who are depending on the system performing various different roles. Each system is unique, and with any of these features, the system is only as decentralized as its most decentralized subsystem, meaning that if the software development is highly centralized to just a few people, then maybe you can't really say the system as a whole is decentralized. Or if the validation is centralized to one or two parties or a colluding group of parties, then it's hard to say the system as a whole is decentralized. It's very easy to perhaps quantify decentralization if you focus only on the physical characteristics of the network, as we talked about, right? You can count computers, but it's really hard to quantify when we're talking about how power is reflected the human side of things, right? I don't know how you quantify. You can say, well, there are 5 developers that have power. Is that more or less decentralized than a system in which 20 people purport to share it? But you have to really look hard at what's actually going on, how power dynamics are playing out. So I think it becomes harder to quantify when we're talking about the people aspect of power. Despite all the rhetoric about how this is something very new, and this is a revolution in decentralization, this is not a new idea. There's a strong echo here from what the people creating the internet believed that they were doing, kind of taking power from existing power structures and democratizing the ability to create content, communicate about important things, and here, the idea seems to be that it's about democratizing people's ability to exchange value, create and exchange value. So there are lots of echoes from earlier conversations about this, even in the tech internet space. And of course, decentralization is a concept that also comes to us from political theory and existing systems that we have, such as, in the EU, right, it's intended to be a decentralized system where laws come down within the center, but the participating countries have choices about how to implement those particular laws to some extent in their jurisdictions. I mean, our basic system in the US, where we have three parts of our government, right? The various branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch, that is intended to diffuse power amongst different groups. So decentralization is not a new idea, and we can learn a lot from prior thinking on these topics about diffusing power. Okay, decentralization is often swapped kind of one for one with the term distributed, talking about distributed systems. And my understanding of these terms, as I've been looking at this, is it can be a bit misleading to use them interchangeably. Distributed just seems to mean that things are divided into parts, whereas decentralized also thinks about who is behind each part. So you could have a distributed system that is controlled by only one or two people and is still distributed.
Yes, I've set them up.
Okay. But it's not necessarily decentralized because you have to think about who is behind the pulling the strings on each of the distributed parts.
Right.
Okay. So what are some learnings we can take about this? Take from this? So decentralization exists on a spectrum. It's not a binary term, despite how it's commonly used in the crypto space. So things can be more or less decentralized, but I'm skeptical that we can say, yes, either you flip the switch and something is centralized or decentralized. It's more of a spectrum. It's also a characteristic that is dynamic rather than static, meaning that the decentralization level of a system is changing from minute to minute as nodes are coming into or off of the system, as mining dynamics might be shifting, as developer dynamics might be shifting. So it's not something that you can say, okay, we hit decentralization and we're done. It's always changing. I would describe it as aspirational at this point rather than actual. People want their systems to have diffuse power and be decentralized, but a fundamental difficult issue here is when someone invents something, it starts off with a few people, and how do you get that to spread to be something that would be fair to characterize as decentralized? This term can also be used to hide power and enable rule breaking. And I do see that, happening a lot here. People are using the term decentralized finance, decentralized systems to mask that there maybe are a few people behind the curtain pulling strings, and they're not recognized because we've described the system as decentralized. Another common thing that I see in the discussions about decentralization from various thought leaders and writers about these topics is that, okay, this is a problem. We cannot continue to just be so sloppy about how we're using this term. It's misleading, so we need to do something about it. Okay. I want to turn now to the concept of power distribution and how decentralization intersects with that. Because I am very skeptical generally about the idea that we're truly diffusing power. And I want to think about some concrete examples of how we're seeing concentrated power showing up in some of the prominent crypto systems, and then talk about a little bit about the legal and risk implications of that. So where is the power, right? If decentralization is about diffuse power, is that really true? Is power actually being dispersed? And is it being dispersed enough that we really can't find, as the SEC seemed to suggest, those agents or humans that would be responsible for something like providing disclosure of risks to people? Is there no one really to do that? So where should we look to find where power lurks within these systems? What are we missing here when we just look at these systems at a very high level and say, they're decentralized? So two important places to look are within the validating networks. Here I use the term mining, thinking about Bitcoin and Ethereum at the moment, and also the software development process, right? Who's leading that? What kind of influence do they have? Are there people who are involved in the software development process that, even though they might not be crafting the actual code, they have very strong influence over the policy choices that are embedded in the code? So let's just look at a very few examples of concentrated power just to kind of make this point. Some things that strongly indicate it to me that it's kind of misleading to describe these systems as decentralized are things that we've seen within the software development world. And those include these covert bug fixes, particularly that we saw in both Bitcoin and Zcash in the past year. So Bitcoin had an inflation bug that was discovered by and reported to a small group of core developers who decided, oh my gosh, this is potentially very serious, and we have to fix it. But if we disclose it to everyone at once, then that could be bad for the system because someone can exploit it and people will lose money, and maybe maybe it's serious enough that people will lose faith in the system, and that could be really bad for Bitcoin's value and stability. So they decided to fix the bug, but told a small number of miners, right, we have to upgrade the system for a less significant bug, and we're not going to tell you about the more significant bug fix that's in here. So after a certain amount of miners updated their software, a few days later, the core devs announced to the world what the real bug had been about. Similar situation in Zcash. There's the flaw was actually, I believe, in the cryptographic proofs underlying the software, and again, there only a few people knew about this, and they pushed a bug fix out to the community in a previously scheduled upgrade, and only after people had upgraded did they announce that it was actually a bug fix. That Zcash one was particularly catastrophic because it also could have inflated the currency, but to my understanding, even more problematically, it could have done so in a way that people would not be able to figure out whether it had happened or not. Okay, so yes, very exciting. So in both of these situations, a small number of people made a decision about what was good for other people within the system. And I think bugs do that generally. I think they really are the I don't know, the Achilles heel of this idea of decentralized governance. Last fall, there was a lot of discussion within Ethereum about Ethereum governance and who should know what when, and similar ideas. Like, if you're contemplating changes to the system, do you need to have a small group of people discussing it first, or does everything have to be public? Thinking back to what's ancient history in the crypto world, right? Concentrations of powers were relevant with Ethereum's DAO hard fork in 2016, where developers persuaded people to essentially revise the ledger to take back funds from the DAO hacker, and the Bitcoin hard fork of 2013, where developers noticed a ledger fork and persuaded enough mining power to switch to the correct ledger. So developer power there. We're also seeing hashing power concentrations among these record producers / miners, and have seen a number of 51% attacks in the wild. So lots of examples of concentrated power. So what can we take from that for legal and risk implications? Well, to me, there are a number of learnings here. This uncertain meaning that I've been discussing here makes decentralization a flawed legal standard. It's problematic, I think, to make legal decisions based on characterizing a system as decentralized, unless we dig a lot deeper into what we mean by that and are precise about what we are characterizing as decentralized. Okay, we talked about how it's a dynamic characteristic, the centralization level of a system. And if it is dynamic, you need to measure it frequently, arguably, if you're going to use it as a legal standard, if legal consequences are going to flow from it. And you could argue that using it as a standard there would encourage gaming of this metric, trying to satisfy it for a particular part in time and then immediately re-centralizing before your next measurement, and et cetera. As I've talked about, I think this is an aspirational characteristic at the moment. And so I think law has to think about things from a present tense perspective. Like, we need to address the risk as they actually exist rather than treating a system based on what it hopes it will become, like that power really will be dispersed in the future, so treat us as if it is now. I'm not sure that makes sense for law. I think we're also creating what I call a veil of decentralization here, potentially. When we describe a system as decentralized and don't probe further into it, we're discussing it as if the power is diffuse, and therefore, law doesn't need to come into that system because no one is acting in a way that law should act upon. And if we, treat that veil there, oh, it's decentralized, as something that prevents us from going after people exercising power behind the veil, I see that kind of as a liability shield akin to the corporate veil, right? There's wow, we don't have to look behind the curtain. We can't hold anyone accountable there. But with corporations, right, that is a power granted by the state, right, to have these various liability protections, but there's also always a legal entity that is accountable. In a decentralized system, you're kind of getting, best of both worlds. No people behind the system because it's, quote, decentralized, but no actual entity there to hold accountable. So I'm wondering if we're potentially making new entities law here by the back door. And then what I call surprisingly malleable tokens. If we believe that power is diffuse in a decentralized system, we would think that they're not very easily changed, so that the tokens have fixed characteristics, and they're not particularly malleable because the system that creates them is hard to change. But if that's not actually true about a given system, if it's actually centralized, then power exercised within that system can result in sudden changes to the system and radical uncertainty. So I think we have a flawed overall analysis from a risk and a legal perspective if we think these tokens are fixed. I think that has implications for things like commodities law, et cetera. I'm not sure commodities really fits it. Okay, so overall, final reflections here, we absolutely need a much deeper inquiry into decentralized before we use it to make legal or risk decisions. And there are, I think, very significant potential consequences if we do use it sloppily, including potentially systemic risk issues from thinking tokens act one way when they act another, and missing the governors of these systems. So I'm really hoping that we will see a lot more research into the power dynamics in each of these very unique systems. So that, I talked a while, so thank you for listening. Happy to discuss anything.
Super. I see that Jetse Spray is on the Zoom call. Jetse, great to have you.
Hi.
Great. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Your audio is a little iffy to my ear, Jetse. Can you either get closer to your mic or switch mics to make sure we can hear you clearly? Because I know you're going to have some good questions.
Yeah.
Better.
Yeah, I think it has less to do with my mic than me and you talking simultaneously, Thomas.
Okay, super. So I know I had some questions for Angela, but I want to take a brief moment and tell you that Jetse is I believe a lawyer by training, certainly extremely knowledgeable.
Great.
And dare I say, skeptical member of our ongoing dialogue in EOS mainnet about governance, and
Okay.
someone whose thoughts I always find very educational.
Great.
Thank you.
So I know that as I was listening, I was wondering, gosh, I'm not a lawyer. I'm wondering, are there any touch points in the law that you're aware of, maybe that I ought to be aware of, around when things are or are not, quote unquote, decentralized? Like, do I have to, if I own less than a certain number of shares in a publicly traded company, then one set of rules applies to me, but when my ownership exceeds some threshold, then suddenly I have other obligations, and what are the thresholds and what are those obligations? Just as a point of departure, because we at least have some pretty well-defined law around corporations.
Right. Right. I mean, yeah. One of the ways that can come up is thinking about obligations that shareholders who have a certain threshold of ownership take on, right? Do they take on fiduciary duties at some point to the rest of the shareholders? And they can. And there's also lots of disclosure requirements built into various parts of the securities laws about when executives or owners are going to sell, right? They have to give a certain amount of notice, or they have to file after they do the sale so people know what they're doing. So yeah, we we think these facts are relevant in other settings, right? How much you own and how that may shape a system or advice that you're giving the system. So it seems to continue to be relevant to me, even though we may have different players filling those roles, such as software developers or miners. So this dovetails with some of the other work that I'm doing, thinking about software developers, certain software developers in these systems actually functioning as fiduciaries within them. And that's been a very unpopular idea, but I still think it's worth discussing. And I'm also working on the mining or validator aspect of that. For my building block in that line of thinking is first kind of trying to get over the hurdle of this discussion of people there being no intermediaries in these systems. And again, I think that's kind of misleading here. I think miners, you can argue, and that's what I try to do in my next paper, that miners function as intermediaries, right? They're the gateway to the record. And some people are okay with this characterization, and others are, whoa, you're crazy. That's fundamentally wrong. So that's I think certain miners arguably function as fiduciaries within these systems. And I have not looked at EOS in detail, but my understanding is that there was something within like the governing documents about such and such are not fiduciaries within these systems.
Yes,
right?
there was an aspirational clause that we wrote into the original Constitution, which has now been replaced. I don't know if the new language that's been adopted that has anything to say explicitly about fiduciaries. But yeah, there was actually a prohibition on anyone accumulating more than 10% of all tokens in a separate statement that there is no fiduciary. And the clear implication, at least to me, I thought it was being clear when I wrote it, that if you somehow succeeded in getting, say, to 11% of token ownership, that the other members would be legally free to strip you of 1% of your tokens and return you to the 10% cap.
Interesting.
Although that was never tested.
Okay. Interesting. So really trying to build in mechanisms to prevent that accumulation of power. Right.
Now, we could go into a long side discussion on how what did and didn't happen under the old regime. But actually, I wanted Jetse to weigh in with his either observations or questions, or what did this remind him of, or anything at all.
Yeah, well, thanks for your presentation. I'm sorry to call in so late. Pretty usually the calls are scheduled at times that I'm.
Yes, I know. I'm messing with you guys' schedule here.
Yeah. So I'm very happy to call in today. Decentralization for a lot of so-called decentralized chains is just there, isn't it? It's kind of a myth that we work in a fully decentralized manner. What I've been working on lately is try to acknowledge that some things have to be dealt with in a centralized way without losing the overall benefits of the decentralization elements. What I'm trying to say basically is that in your presentation, it looks as if there's either centralization or not.
Mm.
I think in practice, we should, my conclusion for now at least is that we should try and find like some centralization. Like it's not a black and white, but it's a gray sort of thing where you have certain decisions that can only be made when certain requirements or certain bodies give their consent. You know, you have different ways of looking at decisions as well. You can decisions being enforced, for instance, or you can have the right to veto decisions. You know, the latter makes you important in a network, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're losing all your decentralized characteristics. Would that be I'm not sure how that will play out in all jurisdictions, because you talked also about fiduciaries. We don't have them in Europe. You know, that's not a big thing over here, and I'm pretty sure there are other things over here that you don't have in America, which are important here. But I'm really trying to find a way to get, let's say, a half centralized or a third centralized sort of blockchain.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good point, and I'm sorry if it came across that I think that it is black and white, because I do think there is a spectrum here, and I think it's fair for certain systems to say we are more decentralized or less centralized than other systems. I think that, you know, certainly many of these kind of the shadier tokens that were issued during the ICO boom, I think it's hilarious that they even, you know, put decentralized along in describing their system. So there's absolutely a wide range, and you know, you could argue that that's what we're seeing the SEC recognizing here, is that maybe Bitcoin and Ethereum are far enough along this range that it's fair to treat them a certain way, fair to treat them differently than we might treat other systems. I guess my background observation there is that for the parts that are centralized, that you just can't get away from, and right now I'm also wanting to dig into the management of bugs, right, security disclosures and stuff, because I can't get around. That's one of the areas that I am going to be very curious to see if people can figure out how to get around that. I think it only has to go to a few people, and that has to be secret. And I think that in places where you necessarily have to have some information asymmetries, that the people in those privileged positions, the people who have information that could give them power over other people within the system, I think that we have to, you know, from a legal perspective, acknowledge that power and treat them appropriately. So there may be fiduciary obligations within these systems depending on what actions the people are performing in them. So to me, the people who receive security bug disclosures on behalf of the system, they're acting as its representatives, and they should, we should expect them to owe duties to the rest, to not exploit that privileged position that they have.
Yeah, which is complicated enough, because if they were to make mistakes or do something stupid, they're free on that.
Yeah.
they can become fully liable if there's nothing to prevent that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff going on regarding, for instance, there's a boss chain that came live based on the EOSIO software as well.
Okay.
And they're currently working on like getting an executive committee together where people have some sort of oversight on the monies to be spent on BOS projects, you know, basically spending money sort of responsibility, which is maybe from a liability standpoint a bit more lenient, easygoing. But when I look at it, I feel like, okay, so we have this. I'm not sure in your jurisdiction, but when you can make decisions in an environment like that, and money is going one way or the other, it looks a lot like some sort of an informal association. And in my jurisdiction, if you act on behalf of an informal association, you're liable for all the shit that goes down.
Yeah.
As a result of that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yep. So I mean, so the tension is, right, acknowledging power that is being exercised, and you know, kind of that undermines the claims about decentralization. But if you don't acknowledge it, maybe you are leaving yourself open to liability if you are acting as, you know, without the protection of a legal entity. But if you do acknowledge it and seek protection of a legal entity, then, you know, are you undermining the whole thing? Like it's. I think it is a challenge. I think that yeah, it's basically experiments in how can people work together, but we don't want to try. We want to do it outside frameworks that we've already come up with. And my feeling is that we're rediscovering why those frameworks evolved as they did, perhaps. In many ways, you know, there may end up being some important differences, and those may be meaningful, but I think in many ways we're rediscovering frameworks.
Yeah, every discussion a lot of discussions I have, I kind of give into my experience as a corporate lawyer. You know, I have to defend decisions because they are based on structures that are existing right now, and everywhere they are everywhere around. So, you know, like shareholders and board of directors, that sort of thing, and the whole governance that goes with it. Somehow, if you try to transport that into the cryptosphere, it's met by very well, people don't accept that easily, to put it very.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. So we shall see.
Yeah, we shall see. There's one issue I would like to ask you. That
sure.
Under EOSIO software, it's 15 nodes block producer that can make all kinds of decisions. Basically, they make all decisions they like regarding the code.
Okay.
That's a very small and very visible number of producers. And I've been stating quite a while that I think that if something goes down on the network, like distributing or running illegal dApps that are illegal, I don't know, that those 21 nodes may be liable if they don't block those dApps.
Yeah. I think that I agree with you. And that is probably what I would be arguing. And I think we're heading down that road with the way that regulators are thinking about anti-money laundering laws, right? Right? I believe that there are some Bitcoin addresses now on the OFAC list. So, I mean, I think that validators are the ones who would be the enforcers, and that's why, you know, I see them as these intermediaries, and I think there's going to be more and more recognition of that fact.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So bad players should be, well, maybe the authorities are indeed focusing right now on the exchanges, but if you would have like a system where the nodes would continue to proceed instruction from, you know, non-compliant exchanges, I think the authority may want to turn to the nodes themselves. Makes sense.
I agree. I think sure, the exchanges seem to present an easier regulatory target, but they're not the only one.
No, definitely. No. Okay. All right.
Great. Thank you.
Super.
Good to
Thanks.
talk.
Well, yeah. Hey, I'm really glad we had this conversation, and I suspect that there's a lot more digging we could do, and I think we're going to need to do quite a bit more digging because this question's not going away. Public nets in particular, if they don't want to be, well, we could go into detail on the dangers of centralization in many different layers, many different levels. But simply, if we were trying to keep the implicit and explicit promises of public blockchain networks, having some sort of dialogue, a lexicon, a unit of measure for levels of centralization and decentralization will in fact be vital.
Yep.
I'm happy to share it. We're currently working on Europe chain, which is a decentralized chain. And that's because of the privacy issues, data protection issues we got here, the GDPR issues, and a bit about regulation. Well, anyway, so the GDPR requires you to have a central entity. So you cannot have a compatible blockchain, so to speak, without a central entity. So we kind of worked on that, and I'm happy to share if
Great.
If you're interested in it. I just wrote down your email address.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
And in fact, Jesse, I'm going to suggest we might consider having the Europe chain folks come on and talk about really the design of the entire system, its centralization approach, and also its various attributes.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Yeah, I would love to do that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, that's all we have time for. I want to say
Great.
thank you to everybody who attended and everybody who watches this. The recording, of course, comes up within a few hours to a day or two after,
Awesome.
after we meet.
Great. So can I ask, is that shareable publicly then?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
All of our meetings are hosted on YouTube.
Great.
The recordings go out, as do the minutes.
Okay,
So,
perfect.
And Angela, I do hope you'll be one of our guests in future.
Yes, I'd like to be. Yes, thank you so much.
Outstanding. All right, well, with that, we are adjourned until
Awesome.
next month, and check
Okay.
your email for the date and time of the next meeting.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being
both.
here.